quite a few successful campaigns down here in the Los Angeles area, including the Clean Ports campaign that we read about in class and that UBPI here has been involved with as well in the past. Yeah, and also just a multitude of other campaigns concerning transportation and air quality. You guys heard from Ben Beach about the sectoral initiative that we're doing with Lane, and I've been working with Adrian on that this semester as well. So yeah, further ado.
Turn it over to you.
Well, great. So I'm glad this is an informal class because I'm a very informal person. Although I did choose a pretty formal profession. As all of you know, the law is pretty formal. It's all about rules and getting dressed up and going to court and sounding all professional and whatnot. But outside of the courtroom, it can be more informal. But I think Ben did a great job kind of summarizing NRDC. We work on kind of almost every environmental issue. It's rare that I come upon an issue that we don't work on. So we have about 400 scientists, lawyers, and policy experts throughout the nation. We have offices in New York, San Francisco, DC, Chicago, Beijing, and a small office in Denver and various other places, and we're kind of working on, we work pretty much all over the nation and a lot of places in the world. I, however, focus on very local issues, kind of our Los Angeles office of NRDC, which is actually in Santa Monica. We moved. We focus kind of more on regional issues, although we do have some kind of national campaigns. So through our office, we work on a lot of whale issues. I don't work on, but everybody loves to work on whales and stuff like that. But I work on more people issues, and specifically more issues impacting people in Los Angeles. I mainly focus on issues that mainly impact low-income communities of color throughout Los Angeles. So I'll talk a little bit about my work. Kind of about 80% of my work is litigation. So I have about a docket of 12 cases that I work on, some in state court, some in federal court. I'm in court relatively frequently, about once or twice a month. You're probably working with some groups that are in court daily, so a lot of times when I'm in court, it's an argument where you spend many months preparing and large briefs, as opposed to kind of daily kind of court work. It's still a lot of work, it's just a little bit different. And then I do about 20% policy work. Kind of the biggest thing I found out through my 7 years working at NRDC, it's better if you don't have to file a lawsuit. A lawsuit should be last resort because it's much better. You can get a policy solution. Litigation is expensive, it's time consuming, in some ways it's somewhat disempowering to communities. But sometimes you have to file lawsuits. It's just the nature of the beast. So the topics I work on is wide range. You heard about the waste campaign. I'm working extensively on that. That's to basically transform LA's waste system in a way that protects communities from facilities that process waste and that achieves our recycling goals. But one thing I would talk about, since you read about it, I work a lot on transportation issues. Everyone read about Clean Ports campaign. That's a very important piece of work that NRDC works on. And then I also work on kind of large sources of industrial pollution. So refineries. Ben's helping me do some research on some refinery and industrial issues for some cases we need to bring. And then, so before I go into kind of more of the nuts and bolts of some of the topics, I guess one question that a lot of people ask, kind of why do you like working at NRDC? I think it's a great place to work. I get to work, I like my clients. I don't think every lawyer can say that. My clients are my friends, and I work pretty close to them. I like the work I do, so every day I get up, I do something interesting, I do something that's going to help people's lives, mainly through reducing pollution so we don't have to breathe the filthy air that we see every day in LA. And then it's also, you know, it's nice to, the nice thing about my job is I get a lot of experience that some other lawyers of my kind of rank may not get. So, you know, I'm in federal court, I'm arguing cases in front of the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. So it's, you know, you get a lot of experience working at a nonprofit. And then the other benefit I see with my cases is, since it's just kind of me and maybe another attorney, if I'm lucky, I get to really know my cases. And, you know, for example, I'll go to a lot of what are called status conferences in court, where, you know, the judge holds these conferences and you discuss the case and, you know, more procedural aspects. It'll be me and maybe one other attorney, and then on the other side there are, you know, 10, 12 attorneys. So, but, you know, at the end of the day, the person who's arguing the case, he may not know the facts as well. He hasn't read the 36,000 page record that I've read and kind of know. So it's there are some benefits, even though sometimes you feel kind of outnumbered. But so let's talk. So feel free to ask any questions. I know it sounds like all of you are working on a lot of different types of issues. I don't know how many people are familiar with environmental work, but there, you know, kind of environmental law is a pretty robust area of public interest law, and there are a lot of cases out there and a lot of people doing this work. Now, clean air work, it's a relatively smaller number, and for reasons I don't know, the Clean Air Act's a difficult statute to litigate under, so maybe that's the reason. But so let's talk about ports. So what did you guys read about ports? Did you read an article, or what were you reading? Anybody remember?
You had readings, yes.
Yeah.
You're basically reading the Treaty of Environmental Justice, the courts reading.
I read Matt Soto's publication from ground up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Martha Menzel.
Martha Menzel, she's here.
Okay.
And
And that talks about the ports campaign.
Yeah, and I don't remember what was the name of the publication that we read about the ports. It was from,
Oh,
Cleaning and safe ports, building a movement, region by region.
is that by Matt Soto also?
Yeah.
It's okay.
Cool, so you guys know a little bit about port advocacy, but that's kind of an interesting story because, you know, NRDC is a large national organization, big budget, big staff, but, you know, the ports, a lot of the ports work started actually where you had some community groups who were frustrated with the port, and the port wasn't listening to them, and they were trying to figure out what to do, so they actually approached, you know, NRDC and other environmental organizations and said, hey, this seems wrong, the port wants to expand, it's not taking our health and the impacts to our communities into consideration. And so, you know, to be honest, at first a lot of the large environmental groups kind of were shying away from it. It seemed, you know, they weren't familiar with ports, they didn't know it was a big battle. You're going up against international trade, so it's kind of lots of teams of lawyers, and you're going up against the city of Los Angeles, so it was a difficult case, but ultimately NRDC and some lawyers at NRDC decided to take the case, and what it was a lawsuit against the Port of LA over an expansion of a shipping terminal. Have people been down to the port and seen the port?
yeah.
So it's down Wilmington, San Pedro. If you get a chance, you should definitely go. It's the largest port complex in the nation. About 44% of the stuff that comes into the nation comes through there. So, you know, the iPods, the keychains, a lot of the stuff that gets shipped out is paper, you know, air. There's a lot of empty containers that go back. So it's basically a lot of products made in Asia get shipped here, and then they get put on either rail or truck and go out to Chicago. But the ports provide a huge economic engine for the region, so there are a lot of jobs. But one of the problems was it created huge impacts on the local communities. So what ended up happening is you had this kind of toxic hotspot right near the ports. So Wilmington, Long Beach, San Pedro, they have some of the highest cancer risks from breathing air in the region and also in the nation. And so what happened is originally the agencies that were responsible for cleaning the air and the ports, they weren't really considering the health impacts, and they weren't kind of listening to the community. And so it took kind of legal action and lots of advocacy and mobilizing of the community to kind of get the ports to listen. And I think what ended up happening is you had one of the better campaigns I've seen, I've heard of nationally, to really reform the port and make it better. But ultimately, it started with a group that was meeting, in someone's house, concerned about, this expansion, not knowing, how to approach it. They found some lawyers, and some lawyers helped them figure out how to win the lawsuit, and we ended up getting a settlement agreement, which led all the way down the road to Clean Trucks program, which is cleaning up all the trucks. We're working on cleaning up the ships. We're working on cleaning up this whole system. And what ended up happening, which was one of the odd things, at first the government and the community groups were just kind of at odds, arguing all the time, and now there's more of a partnership. That doesn't mean we still don't argue. We still have our arguments. I have a different opinion on what needs to be done than someone who might work for the Port of Los Angeles or Long Beach. But at the same time, the community and environmental groups have actually become kind of stakeholders and actually pushing for reform. So it's a good model. And then with the Port Truck campaign, that was an interesting campaign because you added a labor component. Because what happened was we found out that the community groups and the environmental groups, they wanted to clean up this trucking system. And then you had labor who also wanted to clean up the trucking system and also create a better working condition for the drivers who work daily in and out of those ports. So what you had is the Port of LA developing probably the Cadillac of clean trucks programs, and since they've adopted it, it's reduced pollution dramatically, almost 80%, and it's created a new way of thinking about how do you operate ports. So does anyone have any questions about ports, or any thoughts on the ports?
What were your reflections on sort of that reading in particular, or what you're conceptualizing as that coming together, that collaborative experience and working as a community organization and then building that coalition?
I think along the lines of what you were talking about in terms of the sectoral initiative with the waste, it's really important to make those allies with labor, and two groups that have traditionally at times been pitted against each other, when in reality, more than not, they should be allies in terms of labor and environmental advocacy. So I think that making that those connections are really important in terms of getting more of a broader support from the community.
And was that a challenge, making that linkage?
It has been in the past. I thought it was pretty natural in truck context, and the reason is under kind of the law of trucking, it's really hard for local governments to reduce pollution and basically fix the problem. But there were a couple legal theories that could be used, and labor and the environmental community, they separately came to this conclusion, there's this legal theory that when a local government is acting as a business, basically, which the ports are, it's essentially a business, they can do stuff that otherwise they wouldn't be allowed to do. Because a lot of times the regulation of trucking is done from the national perspective, so you have national regulation. So it actually made a lot of sense. But what ended up happening is you had a really close working relationship, so I think it actually helped, actually into the future too, because we had to work so closely together, we learned a lot from each other and learned about this industry together, and we were able to build some key relationships. But it is difficult, because the thing you've got to realize is sometimes labor is going to be opposed to something I'm advocating for and my client's advocating for. So as long as you can get past that, it's not, we aren't going to be aligned on everything, but I think what we realize is we're aligned on so many things that we need to make sure we're pushing. That the waste issue is another issue where labor and the environmental community is aligned.
And you said reference your clients. Who then are your clients in that context?
Yeah. So, I have various types of clients. My clients range, so NRDC has members. We have about 50,000 members in LA. Usually when I have a case, I'm representing NRDC, which are my members. I also represent community groups. So I represent, for example, Coalition for a Safe Environment, which is a community group down in Wilmington. And there's something that's emitting pollution. Inevitably, there's been some group who's tried to resolve this problem. So it ranges from, a lot of environmental justice work actually started around waste facilities and, the siting of waste facilities, hazardous waste facilities and other facilities in low-income communities of color. Environmental justice groups have worked on tons of issues, from airports to dry cleaners. Dry cleaners are heavily polluting, so there was a big campaign to reform the chemicals they used in dry cleaning. They've worked on some of the bigger sources of pollution are refineries, power plants. So I don't know if have you guys been down on the 405 south of the 110? There's a big refinery right off the road. You can see it has a big American flag right on front. But there are all these pipes coming out, and that's where they refine oil. And that releases a lot of pollution. So it's just any types of thing. But what we found is one of the more harmful things are diesel engines. So diesel engines are what run ships, locomotives, trucks, generators, and things like that. And what diesel does, it emits this kind of toxic brew of just chemicals and metals, and people breathe it, makes them sick, so it can lead to respiratory ailments, it can lead to premature death. So basically in this region about 6,000 people die per year from air pollution, and diesel is responsible for a large percentage of those deaths. So it's an important issue, and the problem with diesel is the closer you live to the source, the more harmful it is. So the closer you live to a rail yard, the closer you live to a port, the more impacts you're going to have. The more people are going to get sick, the more people are going to die. And if you look at who lives right next to these ports, these rail yards, they tend to be, a lot of times, communities of color, and a lot of them are low-income communities. So you look at Wilmington, which is right next to the port. You look at Commerce, which, they have people who literally live right next to a major highway that trucks rumble down each day, or a rail yard. So it's a big problem, and what we do as lawyers is we're part of the campaign to help provide solutions. So we look to what are the legal ways that we can help this problem. But a lot of environmental justice is about mobilizing the community and actually getting into city councils and state agencies, local agencies, and complaining about the problem and providing solutions. And really, the lawyers are just kind of one piece of it. But there's a lot of, at the end of the day, there's a lot of stuff to worry about. And one of the problems, actually, you raise a big issue, is one of the problems in certain communities is they might have a port, they might have a rail yard, but they also have a refinery, they also have a power plant, they also have, chemical company that's polluting. So it's what's called cumulative impacts. When you add a bunch of pollution sources in one area, you're going to get many more premature death, more people getting sick. So that's a problem that the environmental justice community has really tried to tackle head on, but it's difficult because it's a hard thing to resolve. So.
Yeah, I was gonna say, do you find that since pollution is such a generalized problem that affects so many people that usually helps you to win cases, or does it make it more difficult because you can't track necessarily where the pollution is coming from?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a great question because we live in LA. So in LA, there's a great book, if you guys have free time, called Smog Town, which is an air pollution history of Los Angeles. And in LA, air pollution has been a big issue for for a long time. So the LA Times and other newspapers have been covering air pollution since the 1940s. In a lot of other areas, people weren't monitoring air pollution. So a lot of times you talk to people who lived in Los Angeles in the 1960s and 70s, they'll talk about days when they couldn't even see a mile. So you couldn't, it just was this dark haze. And that's why LA a lot of times has a bad reputation nationally, because we were the kind of butt of jokes from comedians. So you had people like Johnny Carson making fun of Los Angeles because of its large smog problems and not being able to see downtown. So, but since then, it's been cleaned up a lot. There's been dramatic reductions in pollution. But one of the problems is, even though you can't see some of these pollutants, they're really harmful. They, people breathe them, they get lodged deep into their lungs. Sometimes they enter the bloodstream, so you have all these metals and things going into your bloodstream that, air pollution has been associated with a wide range of health impacts. From, even some studies suggest diabetes and other things are exacerbated by air pollution. So because you can't see that, I think it does make it hard, because I think some people, if you don't see the problem, it's hard to really think it is a problem. And then the other thing is, people see that the air has gotten cleaner, so they say our job's done. However, it's unacceptable that 6,000 people die each year. And it's unacceptable that a lot of the largest sources of pollution tend to be located in low-income communities of color in Los Angeles. So these are problems that I think you raise a good point, because sometimes it's hard to make it an important issue, because people have said, oh, we've been hearing about air pollution since the 1940s, let's talk about whales or polar bears or something else. But we continue to figure out how can we make this an important issue. But the other issue that's kind of air pollution there's a new issue in town called global warming, which a lot of you have heard about. So that has renewed some interest in air pollution, because a lot of times when something emits these kind of pollutants that lead to smog and other particulates that are really dangerous, they also end up emitting carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas, which relates to climate change and all sorts of impacts. So, you had a question?
You mentioned having a really diverse client base, and I'm just wondering if it's been, in your experience, it's been really different having an individual client as opposed to representing a much broader and maybe more abstract group of clients.
Yeah. Well, I think if you have an individual client, sometimes it's easier, because you get one voice. Your client says, "This is what I think," and it's easier to enact. When you have a client that's a community group, there's a lot. It's a lot of people who are in that community or in that group. So you spend a lot of time explaining cases and strategies, and sometimes there is a difference of opinion. So I think it does take a lot more time, because you have to work with folks to get consensus on what the best legal approach is, because ultimately I can't decide for my client what they do. I only provide options to my client, and they have to tell me. And to be honest, sometimes I have my client direct me to do something that I thought wasn't the best approach, but it's the approach they decided they want. So, but sometimes with individuals, it's a little bit easier. The one issue I come across is sometimes I represent lots of clients. So I might have 4 groups that I file a case, and they're all my clients. So that poses some issues, because you need to make sure that you don't have conflicts. A lot of times it's easy because we all have the same goal. Maybe we're fighting a bad project, so everyone has. But sometimes it is difficult, especially if the opposing party, the government, or a company wants to settle. Sometimes people have different ideas on what they should settle over.
You kind of spoke to the widespread nature of environmental justice, kind of the movement as a whole. Do you find it difficult to prioritize the issues? Because I mean, obviously you can't do everything, so how do you decide what cases to take and when and
Yeah,
all those things?
that's a good question. I mean, I think kind of a traditional environmental justice model is you go into a community that has disproportionate environmental burdens and you find out what's important to the community. So maybe they have auto body spray booth which emits lots of pollution, has lots of odors, and it's just really a nuisance. And you know, it may not be the most, somebody might not find auto spray booths the most exciting thing, but if the community thinks it's the most important, then that's what it traditionally do. Now with me, I'm a one-person program, so I can't, you're right, I can't take every case. So when I decide on cases, I generally try to take cases that will have some application to other communities, just because I feel like it's the best kind of use of my time. So either developing legal precedent or working on a campaign that can be replicated elsewhere, that's generally how I choose.
You mentioned that like oftentimes the community has already mobilized themselves around a certain issue. So what are the challenges if the community is not already mobilized when you guys come in to help out?
Yeah. Well, the key is you have to have a mobilized community, because if you're just suing people for the sake of suing people, and you know, people don't, you know, you might sue the auto spray booth when you realize people might like the auto spray booth. Who knows what people like? So you kind of have to. And then the other thing is, a lot of times you need to mobilize community, because what a lot of environmental litigation gives you is not the remedy you need. So sometimes, you know, for example, there are a couple laws. One's called the California Environmental Quality Act, and there's a national law called the National Environmental Policy Act. And what those laws say is that before the government does something, like gives a permit to build an NFL stadium, for example, or allows a power plant to be built, they need to do an environmental analysis, and they need to look at what the impacts of that are. So a lot of times I use that law and we sue over inadequate environmental reviews. But at the end of the day, you know, you just get a new environmental review. You might not get what the community needs. So you do need this kind of community to mobilize, and a lot of times you can get better stuff or remedies from the legislative process. So you might get an ordinance saying, if you want to build a stadium, you need to have a buffer between residents and stadium, whatever the issue is. So I think the thing is they're so enmeshed that you need both. You can't have just one. And you can't have just litigation, because I think you know, lawyers can figure out a way to sue somebody for decades, and you might not ever get any resolution. What you really need is kind of the political process, the community, to get either new leaders in or really just kind of dictate what they want.
So you raised a topic that Ben had got a question about on Tuesday, right, the citing and the potential NFL stadium. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so environmental groups like the California Environmental Quality Act, which is one of the things that some people who want to build big projects want to exempt themselves from. We think it's an important process that allows the public to have an opportunity to see the impacts of the project, allows them to comment on the project, and it allows the government to really understand what they're doing before they actually build a stadium or something like that. But you know, the stadium issue is, there's two proposals, as you probably know. One is in industry, and then one is supposed to be downtown. The industry proposal received an exemption from the California Environmental Quality Act from the state legislature. They got a bill passed, so that's, you know, we were opposed to that bill, but it is what it is. And now there was some rumblings that the proponents of the downtown stadium wanted exemption as well. We're concerned about that. We don't think the compliance with the law makes it more difficult. We think it actually makes projects better. Because by having to look at the impacts of your project, you might decide to do things differently. So we've had several examples where projects have improved as a result of the California Environmental Quality Act. So for example, back to ports, there was a container terminal expansion that the Port of LA wanted to do at the Trepac terminal, and their original proposal was to move a diesel truck expressway 560 feet closer to residences. And you had groups like Communities for a Better Environment, Coalition for a Safe Environment, NRDC, and Coalition for Clean Air coming in and saying, hey, that's unacceptable. We need space between these operations of, heavy polluting equipment and residences. Children shouldn't be playing right next to a rumbling highway with diesel trucks. And what ended up happening is through the process, they actually developed a project that included a huge buffer between the community and the project. So it's a buffer that the government actually touts as a very positive thing. So even they acknowledged that it was a better project than what was originally proposed. And there are other examples that we have of projects improving. So I think a lot of times there's an attempt to vilify the law, and I don't think it's warranted in this. So what do you guys think about the NFL stadium?
I think it's ridiculous.
You think it's ridiculous? Yeah, it's an interesting issue. The thing I'm interested in, which I don't know if other people are interested in, is if you look at the two proposals, which one's better? Which one's better for LA? I don't know. I mean, the industry proposal is way out in the middle of nowhere. Not nowhere, it's an industry, but it's hard to get to. There's no transit proposed. So it will pose some problems. So, anyone else have? Besides it's ridiculous. What do you say?
What gives, what is a good enough reason to be exempt from the California Quality Area?
So if you can convince the legislature to do it, that's so
Yeah.
there have been a lot of exemptions over the years. For example, in 1984, the Olympics were in Los Angeles, and they exempted a lot of the things they needed to build for the Olympics from it. We recently had a power plant, we recently had a government agency receive an exemption for creation of pollution credits, which we thought was a bad idea. But some make sense, some don't make sense to me. But it's just if you convince the legislature, because the legislature created the California Environmental Quality Act, so they can amend it. So right now, I think there are 400 bills to amend the California Environmental Quality Act being proposed right now. So it's really a time when our environmental laws are kind of under assault, especially in Sacramento. One of the things I think that's important for this process, because all of us are working on a lot of different issues, the California Environmental Quality Act doesn't only apply to environmentalists. It applies to anyone. Anyone can provide comments on a project. So a lot of times people have been critical when, for example, a labor group used CEQA to change the project, but it says anyone can use the project. You had the city of Riverside sue under the California Environmental Quality Act against the Port of Los Angeles for failure to disclose impacts of Riverside from port expansion. So it's an important tool to help expose environmental impacts from projects.
Along those lines, are there tools through policy to assess cumulative impact? I know the major issue is right now zoning. I mean, it's common. It's like market forces are going to draw those facilities into low-income communities. So, what policy work have you been involved with to change the way that we address whether or not these facilities can build in places where there is a cumulative impact?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. There are two issues. One is there's a group of environmental justice groups. They have a campaign going to try to fix some of these zoning problems in LA. They're trying to create an approach where you can address cumulative impacts. So when you're siting a new facility, you look at all the pollution in the neighborhood, so you aren't making one neighborhood bear more burdens than they should. And then there's another thing. There was this bill called SB 375, which is a smart growth bill. Are you guys familiar with what smart growth is? Well, smart growth is kind of a concept of more efficient design of cities. So instead of spending tons of money out in the, you know, outskirts of town to build new houses where people have to drive in 60 miles to get to their work, you can focus more inside the city to create more efficient cities. So you reduce, you know, fuel consumption, you reduce energy use. It's just kind of one of these concepts. And so they're implementing these designs, and one of the kind of things, I think, what it's going to entail is more investment inside cities. So I think this provides an opportunity for a lot of these communities to say, hey, as we try to invest in our communities, do we want a highway? Or do we want, you know, a plaza in our central business district that will attract people? Or do we want bike lanes because we have a lot of bicyclists? And, you know, those types of strategies I think people need to use, and it will help kind of alleviate this. But zoning is a big issue. I was just in Houston. Houston has no zoning laws. So I did an air pollution tour of Houston, which if you ever get a chance to do it, it's pretty interesting. They have just huge areas full of chemical companies and refineries. And we went by this one chemical company, and there was a house literally like 10 feet from the fence of that chemical company. So it does pose a problem. But although we have zoning in LA, but
I mean, the Paramount Refinery has an elementary school and a high school literally next door.
Yeah.
So clearly
And it's been the source of a lot of environmental justice fights throughout the year. Kind of industrial pollution sources near schools, near houses. But we're trying to figure out. The problem is it's not easy. I mean, that's the thing. You know, I guess if you get enough smart people, maybe all of you can work in environmental justice groups or environmental groups.
You mentioned freeway expansion, and there's been a lot of proposals with the 710, and but that's a big. Maybe you could speak a little bit about work you've done there.
Yeah, so I work a lot on highway expansion projects. I have two cases against what we consider a bad project that they're building in Wilmington. I also work on the I-710 expansion. I don't know if you're familiar with the I-710, but it's the highway that goes out of Long Beach and it goes all the way up to basically El Sereno. They're two different projects that are very, very expensive projects. I think it's $12 billion to build both, and that's likely an underestimation. On the north end, up near here, they want to build a tunnel through South Pasadena to connect the 710 to, 210, I think, 210. And it's a very expensive proposition, and they call it a gap closure. I tried to get someone to explain kind of what's the best rationale for this project, and there's a lot of discussion, we need to close the gap, and okay, while our maps may be prettier, does it make sense to spend billions and billions of dollars on this? I mean, that's the real question. On the south part, you have a lot, there's an 18-mile stretch where a lot of the trucks that service the Port of Long Beach and Los Angeles go along. And it's some of the highest, there's a lot of air pollution right next to the highway. You have a lot of people who live right next to the highways, and there's a lot of scientific studies that show higher levels of air pollution right next to the highway as opposed to further away. And the proposal is they want to add anywhere from 6 to 8 lanes to this highway, which will also cost, I think, like $6 billion. So it's a huge expansion. It's probably, I think if it does get built, it'll be the largest infrastructure expansion in the nation, or largest road project in the nation. But these projects are huge because we're spending public resources for the expansion of roads. And as you all know, one, we have lots of air pollution problems. And the theory that a new road helps alleviate that, I think, is improper. Because once you build it, you expand it, what we found in LA is people just start using it and it clogs up again. And so instead of having an 8-lane clogged highway, you'll have a 14-lane clogged highway. And then the other problem is if you're spending money on that, you can't spend money on other projects. So we have a lot of transit projects, you know, rail projects, or maybe even bus lanes that we might want to build. So it poses a big issue, but I mainly am working on the kind of the health issues associated with it. And we have, we've been working to try to resolve the kind of increases in air pollution right next to highways. Because in Los Angeles, there are about 1.5 million people who live next to a major roadway. And so currently, under how we create plans to clean up the air under the Clean Air Act, each region or state needs to create a plan to make sure that they're meeting federal clean air standards. Under how it's done currently, they aren't really monitoring near the highways, so we aren't developing plans that will meet clean air standards right next to the highways. So basically what they're saying is, hey, everyone in Los Angeles, you're going to get clean air unless you live next to a highway. And we think that's a problem. And so we want to fix that problem. And I-710 is one of the best examples because you have so many diesel trucks on this one highway that you actually have really high levels of pollution, according to various studies, right next to the highway. So people who live 50 meters from the highway are breathing more polluted air than 100 meters, and it starts to level off somewhere between 300 and 500 meters. So, you know, when posed with this question, some EPA and other folks have said, well, it's a small geographic area. You're talking 300 meters on each side of a highway. And our answer to that is, well, 1.5 million people is a lot of people. I mean, that's, you know, the size of Philadelphia or some other big, you know, urban area. You don't want to ignore those 1.5 million people. So this is a good example of kind of, this issue is a good example of combining litigation with community advocacy, because we are working with some environmental justice groups. We filed lawsuits against the Environmental Protection Agency for this practice. We have, there are a bunch of community groups up in the San Joaquin Valley that have mobilized around this issue. So they're doing a petition that they put on Facebook to EPA to resolve this problem. And then we also have a lot of community groups locally that are trying to pitch our local agencies to really address this problem. So it's a good example of how you use all the different tools to try to fix the problem. But highways are a huge issue in LA, just because I think, you know, highways have traditionally divided communities, and one of the issues that I'm really interested in, be interested to get your perspective on it, is in South Los Angeles. That's you know, ranging from Long Beach, you have Watts, you have Commerce, Vernon, all these areas. They get a lot of infrastructure investment in those regions, but mainly it's through highways. And highways aren't really investing in the community. So you're investing in this little tube of concrete where people can go through the community, but you aren't really providing that much investment in the community. So you aren't fixing up local streets, or putting trees in local streets, or building bike lanes or pedestrian places where people can be out on the streets, or fixing lights. And so I think it's a problem because you have, you know, there is a lot of investment, but they aren't investing in the right things, I think, in those communities. So that's one issue I'm working on probably in the next couple of years. The nice thing is not litigation, it's more affirmative. It's kind of, let's fix up these communities, let's try to get funding for them. So, but does anybody spend much time down in South LA? Or down there?
That's where my office is, in
Okay.
Florence area.
Okay, great.
Yeah, but I haven't looked into that very much yet.
Yeah. It's interesting, from an environmental justice standpoint, it's really interesting because a lot of the pollution sources are concentrated right in that area. So if you look at, I should have brought a map. If you look at a map of it, there's this band that goes through South LA of a lot of pollution sources. And then it goes out east too. So you don't see as many in Beverly Hills. So.
When you say try to get funding for them, where does that come from?
Well, it's becoming increasingly harder, but I think there's some state funding through various bonds, but there's also federal funding. So I mean that's the big issue. But it's becoming increasingly harder because, as you all know, there's budget problems at the state, at the local level, at the federal level. So it's trying to find that funding is difficult. But at the same time, they're also try to attract private investments of businesses. So for example, I work with some groups in Watts. There's a vacant industrial site that they want to attract a business park to. They're having a hard time, so that's not necessarily finding state or government funding. You just need to find someone who wants to be located there.
On the issue of like funding at an organizational level, I've been really interested, I'm kind of curious as to the dynamic that you feel as NRDC is like a mainstream, pretty prominent organization, how you feel they prioritize environmental justice work, work that's, as we've established, heavily concentrated in urban areas and in communities of color and low-income communities. And I know, like, traditionally, a lot of the environmental movement has been really focused on traditional kind of conservation issues. You mentioned the popularity of the whales. I think that's like the snazzy kind of sexy issues that they get a lot of their funding for. Supporting the polar bears and whatnot. How do you feel like they prioritize your work like they should, or?
So that's a good question. So I think there's traditionally been a tension between environmental justice groups and large organizations like NRDC, Environmental Defense Fund, sometimes Sierra Club. So basically the tension is between a lot of my clients and my organization. So it is kind of a difficult situation. I think, not to sugarcoat, I think big environmental groups could do more on environmental justice. I think they currently do a lot when they're advocating for Clean Air Act protections and other things like that. That's something that benefits, the whole nation, including environmental justice groups. There aren't as many attorneys at NRDC that work on kind of very local environmental justice issues. You have me in LA, we have the lawyer in New York, we have some other lawyers in LA who do this work, and then we have litigators who work on environmental justice cases in Tennessee and other areas too. So, but it's a fair critique, there could be more.
So what do you feel are the pros and cons between working at an organization like NRDC versus working at an organization that's more community-based like CBE, who also has staff lawyers?
The NRDC has more resources. Granted, we don't have as many resources as the big law firms that we're going up against, or even, for litigation, states and cities. But we do have more resources, so CBE might have fewer resources. With that said, they still have some resources to hire lawyers, and I think it's different options. But the other thing at CBE is so in their LA office they have one lawyer, whereas I'm in an office with 13 lawyers. So I have lawyers who have 30 years of experience, so I can learn from them, and I'm less kind of out there doing it myself, learning how to do it. So I think it's a resource issue. Is one of the big issues.
Do you ever feel
benefits to both.
Do you ever feel like those organizations, I don't know if they have more credibility in the community, or do you feel like it's easier for them to build connections with other community organizations and community members than someone coming from a mainstream organization like NRDC?
Yeah, I think so, because they have organizers who are dedicated to that region. I think one of the big mistakes that environmental groups have made in the past is to come in to a problem and not really meet with the community, or come in to address an issue that they might be concerned with and leave. So how do you actually help the community address the needs that it has? And then the other thing is, you're just one piece of the whole pie. So there's a lot of advocacy and a lot of strengths from the community. So I think that's one of the problems. So I try to do work that leaves more capacity in the community, continue doing similar type of work, or continue to address the issues, even if I may not have a case or time to advocate in the future. But it is an issue that needs to be addressed. I think, me personally, I think environmental groups big green groups could do more environmental justice work. But, you know, one of the big issues is funding. There's a finite amount of funding, so you don't want big green groups getting all the funding that local groups should get to do the work. So it's another tension. Any other questions? I don't know if there's anything else to cover. I mean, I can talk about some of my other work. I mean, the other thing that's kind of an interesting component of what I do is I'm not always suing someone, you know. 'Cause a lot of people think I do, especially the people I sue often. They think, oh, all you're doing is suing people. But sometimes we actually get involved in litigation to help defend good things. So, you know, through years of work, we've been able to get the state to adopt a rule to reduce pollution from ships. Ships are a huge problem to local communities down in Long Beach, St. Peter, and Wilmington. And what ended up happening is industry associations challenged these regulations. So what my colleagues and I sometimes do is we ask the court if we can become a party to help the government defend the regulation. Because we, you know, and we help the government by providing legal resources. We file briefs opposing industry associations that might challenge regulations. So I actually do a fair amount of that as well. So I have a case down in Imperial County where the county wants to challenge an EPA regulation, an EPA action that is requiring them to reduce more pollution. So we're intervening to help a couple environmental justice groups and other folks down there. We'll likely intervene if we're allowed. An industry association has challenged a rule to clean up trucks throughout the region. So I think one of the important things and one of the nice things about my job is I can help, you know, defend things that we worked hard to get our government agencies to pass. It's not always, hey, I'm suing you because, you know, you violated the law. Or, so.
What do you see as sort of issues that students at this point should be thinking about, right? Things that are going to be coming up in the next 3 or 5 or even 10 years from now that we're maybe not working on right now, but you just think are going to be really critical to be on the lookout for.
I think one of the biggest things, I think two of the big things. One is how climate change impacts environmental justice communities. You know, you have these areas, if you're low income and then your physical conditions are taken to the extreme, it's either hotter or colder, you're imposed with more burdens or sea level rise, things like that. I think that's going to be a huge issue moving forward, is how do you address that. Second thing is, I think the smart growth issue, which it is a civil rights issue, because what increasingly happened in the last 30 years is you saw what investment was made in center cities, it went out to the suburbs. And so what you have are these kind of decaying parts of cities, and a lot of times it's where low-income communities of color live. So if you look at places like Detroit, you see these just completely degraded parts of the town because there hasn't been this investment. There's been investment in the outskirts, but not in the inner part of the city. And you know, there are a lot of people who are saying this is a civil rights issue. If you have these parts of the city that are just kind of completely decaying, it's, you know, it's bad. One, it's bad for the city, but two, it's also it's a civil rights issue. We need to more equitably spend our funding. So instead of spending $12 billion on a highway in this community, maybe we figure out some better use of funding for that community. So,
has there been any kind of a push for regional level of government like we have in my hometown of Portland, down in Los Angeles? Is there anybody speaking about that as an option, or?
we do have a regional agency called our Metropolitan Planning Organization, and it's called the Southern California Association of Governments. Yeah, they could be doing more. They've got some charges to be more aggressive in how they look at transportation and things like that in the future. So there is kind of a regional level, but you got to think this agency covers all the way from Santa Monica to, I think it's Riverside. So So it's a very huge, geographically diverse, politically diverse group, and so sometimes that makes it difficult for them to get the policies in place that are needed. It also covers Orange County, which is very different than LA County. So, but regional planning is important because it helps minimize these environmental justice. But the other thing I think that's going to be big is there are a lot of environmental justice mandates out there, and I think I have some friends and colleagues who work in the environmental justice movement, and what they say is every agency and every company and every big green group and all these folks, they love environmental justice, they love to talk about it, it's a great thing, but when it comes to actually doing something about it, that's where they falter. So the kind of how they talk about it doesn't come through in their actual actions. So they might say, oh, environmental justice is the most important thing, but then they allow a power plant to be sited in a low-income community in color if they're evading the laws. So those are big issues.
Other questions from you? It's Thursday, spring breakers next week. People are gonna come.
So now you guys are going to go work on environmental justice issues.
That's right.
That's very great.
Oh, and that's actually, I think, an interesting question. If we wanted to, say, have Ben organize a tour for us to go look at different sites here in LA, where would you recommend?
I would recommend, there are a lot of them. I would recommend going to Vernon. Vernon's really interesting. Boyle Heights is really interesting. And you can see kind of communities right next to the pollution sources. But you can go anywhere. I mean, even, people assume the West Side doesn't have environmental justice, but, there are some communities that are low-income communities on the West Side that are right next to large pollution sources. So there are a lot of options, but I think Vernon is particularly interesting. The other thing is you can go to Commerce and see some of the rail yards. It's hard to fathom how big they are until you actually see them.
Yeah, I think if no one's seen the ports too, the ports you
ports,
can't
yeah.
even imagine how big the ports are until you get down there. And they do tours on there. It's pretty
Yeah, if you
wonderful.
contact Jesse Marquez or Communities for a Better Environment, they may be able to organize a
Yeah,
tour.
I talked to Bill about it.
Yeah, but it's definitely good. And then the other thing, it's hard. Here I come. Well, I'm just a lawyer, so I write stuff down and submit it to court. But it's hard to really understand what something is until you get out there and see it, you smell it. You see how close it is. It's hard to really understand. I think, and once you get out there and see it, you really appreciate that people are dealing with this daily. Their kids are breathing this noxious air and smelling this terrible pollution. So, yeah.
Working with these low-income communities of color, have you encountered barriers in, relating to people in those communities and sort of gaining their trust and?
Yeah, I'm a lawyer on the West Side who, sits in my office and types all day, and that's different than, someone who's right next to I don't live next to a refinery. I don't live next to a large source of pollution. So, I think the biggest thing is, as lawyers, you need to listen to your clients. I think it's good to be involved with groups that have really strong organizers and kind of community liaisons. And I think as long as, as a lawyer, you aren't over-promising, you're explaining all of the legal issues to your client, and then you're actually listening to them, I think, it works out well. Sometimes lawyers have big egos, so that third part of actually listening is tough.
How did you get involved in environmental justice?
It's an interesting issue. So I've always been interested in environmental issues. I grew up in kind of a rural area or small town in North Carolina, and so I was always outdoors and doing stuff like that. Went to college and studied environmental science and policy. And then I went to law school, and I thought I wanted to do water pollution work, but then I got interested in environmental justice. I worked at NRDC one summer, and actually for about 5 years I solely did air pollution work, but a lot of my air pollution work was environmental justice work. And then I became the environmental justice attorney in our office, and my cases remain air work, but I think it is one of the big environmental justice issues. But I think it's compelling to me because I think it's a big issue and there aren't as many lawyers working on it as opposed to some other environmental issues. So for example, climate, there are a lot of people working on climate. There aren't as many people working on environmental justice. But it's an exciting area.
Has there been individuals trying to bridge that gap at all? Because as you said,
There's a lot of groups who are working on climate issues from an environmental justice perspective. So I work with the lawyer Angel Johnson-Mazaros who does that. So there are a lot of people working on it.
Let me ask you